What is death? Several of our students have requested that I move one of our courses, the Death Ritual and Magic course that was on Sanctum's private seminary, to our public YouTube channel, and I'm happy to do so. And this is where it starts, with defining our terms. What do we mean when we say death? What do we mean when we say ritual? What do we mean when we say magic? Because this is a course on death, ritual, and magic. Before I get into defining death, I just want to note that this course, even simplified for YouTube, will be incredibly in-depth. It's going to take me at least a year to get through it. And that first it covers defining terms and then goes into the ancient history of death, ritual, and magic, starting with prehistory and moving through ancient Mesopotamia, coming down to the modern day. And then it gets into the practicalities. So I'm not going to apologize for how in-depth this course is. This is actually the shorter version of it that I will be moving onto YouTube. If you want the notes that accompanied the really in-depth classes that we hosted on Sanctum's private seminary, you can find those on Patreon. We are on Patreon at patreon.com/Sanctum of the Craft, and there's an entire Death Ritual Magic section on there, and all the notes have gone out, and several booklets have gone out to patrons at certain tiers as well. The first term that we're going to start with defining for this course is death. It may seem like quite a simple term to define, but it has actually been a matter of much debate throughout history and to the modern day. Death has been an absolute since the beginning of life itself, and throughout human history, the cultures of the earth have debated its meaning. Death may be defined very differently looking at it from different perspectives, all of which the definition may be quite vital to, whether that is an ethical, legal, civil, political, religious, or family-related view. The more closely one looks at the issue of defining death, the more complex the matter becomes. Death has been defined many ways throughout history. Death has traditionally been defined through a combination of cultural ideas, religious beliefs, and biological observations. Many of the ancient definitions of death were based in cultural, spiritual, and religious ideas of the spirit being present in the body during life and gone from the body after death. Most of the information about how various cultures and religions have defined death will be covered in the course portions, Cultural and Religious Perspectives on Death, and the timeline of death, ritual, and magic. For now, I will note that there was a major shift in attitudes towards defining death, especially in a legal context, from the end of the 17th century through to modern day in the Western world. Even the very first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica from 1758 CE stated, "Death is generally considered the separation of the soul and body, in which sense it stands opposed to life, which consists in the union thereof." By the 15th edition, that definition had changed and was much longer, more than 30 times its original length. It referred to death as the supreme puzzle of poets in 1973. Much of the shifting attitudes regarding death were fueled by scientific discoveries during the 18th and 19th centuries, with advances in biomedical knowledge and technology deepening our understanding of the physiological process of death. In the Western world, through most of antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, death was defined as given in the Encyclopedia Britannica definition from 1758, the separation of the soul from the body. This was consistent with broader cultural and religious ideas of the Western world, including that the universe was divided, and humans themselves were divided, into material and non-material essences. Material essence could die and decay, but the immaterial would not. The body died, but the soul persisted. Beyond that, there were three main models of death: death as a state of existence or non-existence, death as an event, and death as a condition. Death as a state of existence or non-existence was the primary model of many religions, and very much so the model of the Christianized Western world for thousands of years. It essentially defines death as what happens to the person after death. It does not define death as the event that ended the life, nor the biological activity that led to the cessation of life, but rather to the transition in form of existence that was thought to occur when the temporal, physical, and material life ended and some other form of existence began. Death as an event defines death as a thing that happens, a singular phenomenon with a particular time and place that can be observed. Death as an event can go down on a death certificate with a specific time, place, and cause, even if that information might be imprecise, incomplete, or inaccurate in specific cases. The idea of death as an event does not address cultural or religious concerns over the existence of a soul or what happens to it thereafter, and is only concerned with the moment when life ceases and death has occurred. As the Western world transitioned towards a scientific approach towards death, this became a much more common model. Death as a condition understands death as a biomedical occurrence that causes an organism to be incapable of continuing the vital functions of life. Although similar to, and in many ways overlapping with, the model of death as an event, it focuses more on the specific signs that prove the cessation of life function. Those signs are exceedingly important when it comes to ethical and legal matters, such as organ donation and inheritance. It would seem straightforward with clear signs that anyone and everyone can agree on, signifying that life has ceased. However, the more that we actually understand about the physiological processes of life, the more complex this model becomes. Generally, the death as a condition model includes the idea that death must be permanent and non-reversible, as a death-causing condition might be reversed and life restored. For example, if death as a condition were to be based on the cessation of a heartbeat, but the heartbeat was restored. The term death is also used in other ways, primarily to intensify meaning in a figurative sense, such as in usages like the death of such and such industry, or this will be the death of me. Even terms such as the eventual heat death of the universe may be debated as to whether that would be literal or figurative death. The disagreements over what model is best and what to consider the standard of death have caused many legal and ethical battles. Issues with the definition of death as the moment the soul leaves the body, or even the model of death as a state of existence or non-existence, include whether or not there actually is a soul, and if so, what a soul is exactly, and then when does it leave the body and where does it go upon doing so. Even if everyone agreed on this, which we most emphatically have not throughout history, how would one prove these in a scientific fashion that would have any kind of legal recognition? So far, the soul has not yet been observable or measurable with empirical evidence for its presence or absence. The models of death as an event and death as a condition are also a matter of scientific, legal, and ethical debate. So let's get into those biomedical models and the definitions of death. For thousands of years, a very basic biomedical model was used to determine death. The heart ceased beating and the person stopped breathing. Other tests were sometimes employed if there was a reason to doubt a person might not actually be dead. They might be shouted at, slapped, their body might be moved, they might be pinched or stuck with pins. If the person did not respond and their pulse and breath were both absent, the person was determined to be dead. There were cases where people had all the basic signs of death and yet turned out to be alive. In the fortunate cases, this was caught before the body was processed as a dead body, through whatever means, be that cremation, burial, etc. Unfortunately, there were cases where people were burnt or buried while still being alive. These cases became a subject of morbid curiosity in the Western world during the 18th through the early 20th centuries. As cases were documented of people being assumed dead who were not, medical professionals and scientists started to attempt more resuscitations and revivals of those who were assumed to be dead. Although there were many cases where this was unsuccessful, during the late 18th century there started to be some successes, particularly in cases of drowning, where people appeared to be dead, no pulse, no breath, failure to respond to stimulation, but they could be revived with the techniques that were being developed. Many of the methods of revival and resuscitation developed during this time period were the basis for the techniques used in emergency situations in the modern day. Attempts using galvanic stimulation inspired the fictional Dr. Frankenstein's attempts to reanimate the dead with lightning and eventually led to the use of the defibrillator, which, despite its portrayal in medical dramas, does not actually restart a heart that has ceased beating. Towards the middle of the 20th century, successes with cardiopulmonary resuscitation, also called CPR, and the development of life support systems prolonged or even restored vital functions in people who would have previously been considered dead. People could even be kept in persistent vegetative states, which brought up questions of whether those people were alive or dead or in some kind of in-between state. These advances complicated the scientific and legal definition of death. Today, there are three main biomedical models of death: cardiopulmonary death, whole brain death, and neocortical death. Cardiopulmonary death was and is based on the traditional medical model, and it focuses on organ function. Death is considered to have occurred when the heart and lungs cease. The cessation of heartbeat, blood circulation, and breathing are still used to define the clinical death, which is still the standard frequently used by doctors to declare a person dead. One issue with the cardiopulmonary model is that resuscitation may restore organ functionality. Was a person still legally dead if they had been revived? Advances in life support technology have also complicated this model. A person may have their heart continue beating, their blood circulate, and their lungs oxygenate their blood, but they may be in a persistent vegetative state for years. Advances in the field of biology have also found that individual cells that make up larger organisms die throughout the organism's life, and that there are some regulatory signals that are sent to cells that program cell death under certain conditions. Although this is an ongoing field of study, it has made it clear to scientists that any biomedical definition of death would have to include an understanding of the basic internal life processes of an organism. This brought additional complication to the definition of death. Exactly how many and which kind of life processes needed to cease for someone to be considered dead. The whole brain death model was developed to address deficiencies in the cardiopulmonary model. The model is based on the idea that when the brain is dead, the person is dead, regardless of whether the heart and lungs have kept functioning via life support. Advances in monitoring the electrical activity of the brain made it theoretically possible to establish brain functionality or brain death. A survey was conducted of patients who had no electrical activity in their brain when measured by EEG, and only 3 out of 1,665 patients recovered cerebral function. All 3 had been in a drug-induced coma. This and other studies caused a debate as to what distinction should be made between coma and brain death, where it was determined that brain death should refer to a state of severe and irreparable brain damage that would prevent any functionality from returning. In 1968, an ad hoc committee of the Harvard Medical School proposed that the non-reversible loss of brain functionality should define death if used alongside the cardiopulmonary model. The model recommended by the committee had criteria that would be measured 24 hours apart: lack of receptivity and response to external stimuli, absence of spontaneous muscular movement and breathing, absence of observable reflexes, including brain and spinal reflexes, lack of blood circulation in the brain, and absence of brain activity as signified by a flat EEG. The Harvard criteria became the dominant approach to defining death in a medical context and was accepted by the American Medical Association and the American Bar Association. This model still has issues. If a patient has undergone severe hypothermia, drug or metabolic intoxication, or circulatory shock, it may actually suspend life processes. The model of neocortical death is based on the idea that it should not take the whole brain dying for a person to be declared dead. The neocortex of the human brain has been theorized to be the seat of a person's sense of self, including their consciousness and awareness, sense perception, memories, thoughts, and their ability to use language. Some medical ethicists and scientists argue that it shouldn't be the loss of biological function that determines death, but the loss of the individual that should determine death. However, others argue that parts of the brain can survive even the death of the neocortex. Tragic cases of people who have experienced neocortical brain death but continued on in a vegetative state have also been brought into this debate. So what is the established legal definition of death, and why does it matter? The Uniform Law Commission drafted the Uniform Determination of Death Act in 1968, which established a legal definition that was adopted almost nationwide. It was based on the aforementioned Harvard University's ad hoc committee recommendations. Harvard's ad hoc committee was put together by the medical school to consider an ethical issue made urgent by the world's first successful heart transplant in 1967. Legally, it was urgent to determine if a person was considered dead before removing a heart for transplant, or if removing a heart for transplant made a person dead. The new criteria established by the committee led to the so-called dead donor rule, which allowed for organ donation from brain-dead donors even if they had a heartbeat. Neurologists have to determine brain death by neurological criteria before organ donation, but it does permit a person to be on life support with a heartbeat and still donate organs, as they meet the neurological criteria for death. The volunteer organization, the Uniform Law Commission, drafted the Uniform Determination of Death Act in order to standardize laws on the matter across the United States, which had disparities in how they legally approached the matter of death. The ULC worked with the ABA, the AMA, and a presidential commission for the study of ethical problems in medicine and biomedical and behavioral research in approving and establishing the UDDA shortly after its publication in 1981. Although healthcare is generally a matter of state law, it provided a standard model. The Uniform Determination of Death Act defines death as circulatory and respiratory functions irreversibly stop, or all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, irreversibly stop. It's the "or" that has caused some legal issues. The legal definition of death outlined by the UDDA is relevant to determining legal matters of inheritance, life insurance, wrongful death suits, and charges of homicide. It also affects the procurement of organs for donation. As of 2023, the UDDA has been adopted by 37 states and the District of Columbia. An example of a state that has not adopted it is New Jersey, which uses the cardiopulmonary model and determines death by when a person's heart and lungs cannot function without life support, but the law does have a religious exemption. The UDDA is currently being revised as experts in medicine, law, ethics, and philosophy are calling upon it to be updated. Concerns raised for possible revision include whether the term irreversible should be replaced by permanent, the question of hypothalamic pituitary function and brain death, issues of consent on declaration of death, and more. As more powerful and refined technologies and techniques are developed that allow for better life support, improved monitoring of brain activity, and organ replacements made via other means than dead donors, stem cell grown organs, technological replacements, the definition of death may and probably will change again. So some questions that I invite you to consider. These aren't assignments. This is on our public YouTube, so I can't actually give you assignments. But some questions that I invite you to consider. Why is it important to define death? What medical criteria should be used to define death? What are some consequences that may arise from defining death a particular way? Can someone die and then be revived, or were they then not actually dead? When do you think it is appropriate to declare a person dead and remove life support? That is my cat whining to get in. But one of the ways that I have seen death defined in the spiritual community involves saying, well, it is the cessation of life. So I'm going to touch on the defining of life, but I want to note that we will get into various cultural perspectives on death, including how they define death as we move through the timeline and as we address different cultural perspectives on death before we move into practical death magic and ritual. Just as it is important to define death, it is also important to define life. The definition of life and a model for its structure has been debated since ancient times. The Greek pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles claimed that life was composed of 4 eternal elements. Aristotle, on the other hand, asserted that living things had to have souls and embody both form and matter. It's a challenge because life is a process and not a measurable substance. Additionally, life may not necessarily meet any standards set forward to define it, especially as our understanding of the universe grows. There are over 100 different definitions of life that have been debated, and all of them have their own flaws. Some scientists define life as a self-sustaining biological process that involves the basic life processes of growth, response to stimuli, movement, maintenance of homeostasis, and reproduction. However, there are debates as to whether all life even meets those criteria, and if a person is considered dead as soon as those biological processes cease. For example, is a virus not alive or dead because they cannot reproduce without a host? What about a person who has been exposed to a lethal dose of radiation and whose cells have stopped replicating? They may be dying, but are they no longer alive? Are they dead before all of their other life processes have halted? This matter is also debated in terms of the specific emphasis placed on the question of what it means for a person to be alive, specifically if the emphasis is on the person being alive or the person being alive. Philosophers argue that the body or organism might be dead, but the person may not be. Questions to consider, which again cannot be an assignment because this is on our public YouTube channel and not on the private seminary. You're not trying to earn a degree through the seminary, and thus I cannot give you homework. But I invite you to think about these. What criteria should be used to develop a definition of life? What does it mean for a person to be alive? What does it mean for a person to be alive? When people define death as an absence of life, What does that mean when life has no fixed definition? Okay, now that we've gotten through that, in our next video, we're going to talk about the fear of death and why it is that so many people respond strangely to the fact that I identify as a death witch. And then after that, we're going to define ritual and talk about what exactly death ritual is. But that'll be our next video. Please remember on our public channel to like and subscribe and leave us a comment. This course is going to be going for the next year or so, along with us migrating our first year of the Witches, Poisons, in Depth over to YouTube as well. So anything that you can do to sort of support us and just like our content, please like, share, leave a comment, send us questions for Ask a Witch. You can also find us on Patreon. We are under patreon.com/Sanctum of the Craft, and all of the notes for all of our courses go up there. There's tarot, there's witches' poisons, there's entheogens, there's the history and traditional use of abortifacients, there's the death ritual and magic course, there's the practical magic course. Gosh, what else do we have on there? Oh, and there's a bunch of infographics and posters and things that we've designed for our students. The most recent one was a Visconti di Madroni poster, basically all the surviving cards of the trumps of the Visconti di Madroni deck turned into an infographic poster for everyone. So yeah, you can find us there, patreon.com/Sanctum of the Craft, and our lowest Patreon level is $1 a month, so, check us out. Be safe out there, everyone. Have a good night.